everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. Today I'm joined by Dr. Oliver Grundmann at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and a professor of medicinal chemistry there. I was told you were one of the most highly cited people or most published people on Kratom. Is that accurate?
Well, I've never checked that out. I'm not necessarily that attached to citations, but maybe I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. It's certainly possible. I don't know. Maybe.
Mm-hmm. So you've published on it a bit, and
Yes.
yeah, you've made kind of a reputation around it a little bit, which is great. But before we go there, I want to learn a little bit more about you. So you're originally from Germany, and you had an interest in pharmacy or chemistry that kind of led you in this direction.
Yeah. So I studied pharmacy at the Westfälische Wilhelms-Universität in Münster. Not to be confused with the cheese, but I don't think it originated there. But that's a different story. So I studied pharmacy there, and I didn't really picture myself going into academia. But then, kind of fortune had it that. Or fate had it that I met my doctoral advisor, who was also from Germany, during my last year, and she had an interest in natural products, and I had an interest in pharmacology, and kaboom! I ended up at the University of Florida and did my graduate studies in the CNS activity of natural products, and yeah, that got me into academia and to the United States in 2004. So it has been 17 years.
Oh wow, it's quite a bit of time, and an interesting 17 years in American history.
Oh yes, oh yeah, certainly.
Great. And so I was introduced to you through Soren, who runs, I think the firm is called Top Tree Herbs, which is a kratom manufacturer that makes some interesting teas. And he's actually the one who helped me get in touch with Hamilton Morris, which is great. So I'm grateful to him for that. And I was able to start drinking this tea, and it was really interesting. I was a little nervous. I'm like, I should probably wait till a Sunday till I know if I'm going to like screw up my day or not, you know? And it was fine. It was kind of just like, a little different than coffee, a little different from a beer. I don't really know exactly how to categorize the experience of like 1 to 3 of these tea bags, which I actually don't know the doses of, by the way, which is, I know it's on the packaging, but I know dose response is a really interesting consideration here, and same with route of administration, right? Like, there's probably a lot of problems that go with certain routes, and others not so big of a deal. So I'm kind of curious, like, how did this plant come on your radar to start investigating?
Yeah, so I didn't know about kratom until 2015, when a graduate student of mine who works in law enforcement and was going to school part-time in South Florida mentioned that he came across a case that he worked on where a post-mortem sample of blood showed up where kratom exposure was reported in a relatively young adult who was exposed to or was using kratom, leading to either an intentional or unintentional car accident. So it wasn't clear if he attempted the car accident on purpose or if it was unintentional. But kratom was ingested, and I had never heard of it. So I did some research, and became clear to me that although we explored some of the pharmacology of it, which is thanks to Chris McCurdy, who was doing quite a bit of work already at the University of Mississippi prior to coming to the University of Florida. We didn't really know who was using kratom, what is the typical kratom user, and for what reasons. is he actually using kratom? We've heard that, yes, in the traditional setting in Southeast Asia, it's used for pain relief or as a stimulant when the fresh leaves are chewed. But how does that compare to the United States, where you cannot get just fresh kratom leaves and pick them off a tree or just consume them within a relatively short period of time? So I was just like a little bit naive, maybe, thinking that, well, let's just throw out a survey and see if I get a couple of hundred responses. And I did that in 2016, end of 2016. And I'm trying to really be conscious of the timeline. So the first paper came out in conjunction, which was a review on kratom pharmacology, what we knew, its traditional uses, with the student and with another student. So it was Marcus Warner and Nellie Kaufman. It was just really summarizing what we knew up until then. And then in 2016, I conducted that survey just by myself. I collected some survey questions that were like CDC style, what the CDC would usually ask in terms of age categories and demographic information and that kind of stuff. And I just contacted the American Kratom Association and was asking them if they would be willing to just use their network to distribute the link to the survey. That's all that I asked them to do. And I set the upper limit, and I was thinking way too high, because who would, how many people could there be? I set it at 10,000. And I basically made the cutoff in the IRB and the Institutional Review Board protocol that needs to be approved for human subject research. And I set it to 10,000. Said to myself, well, it's not going to fly. It's just going to be a couple of hundred responses. Within 2 weeks, I reached the 10,000 after I distributed the survey. And I'm like, okay, I guess I have to shut it down now. I couldn't go further than that, which was, I didn't expect that. So was the first.
It's incredible, by the way. I don't think any psychedelic survey has had that kind of response.
It was incredible. I was like blown away. It's just like, it was really incredible.
Do you know how that worked? Was it included in product packaging or something, or just everybody put it out on their emails or something?
I think what the AKA, the American Kratom Association, just did, I think there was really an eagerness, because at that time, shortly before that, in 2016, the DEA had announced their plan to schedule kratom. They placed it into Schedule 1. And then there was this public outcry, the 40,000 comments because they wanted to place it without public commenting into Schedule 1. And then 40,000 comments and a few members of Congress said, basically were opposing that, together with some researchers. There were some letters that were sent, and then the DEA withdrew that intent, which it doesn't do very often, to withdraw the emergency scheduling. And the FDA was still kind of pushing for it all the while, very heavily on one side. So I think there was an eagerness from the Kratom community, Kratom user community, to kind of show how they were using, how they were using Kratom, or how Kratom is being used.
That makes sense. And it's, this is, I guess, just another iteration of our really interesting war on drugs and plants. And like over politicization and using it as a social tool without having good data yet. And it just seems goofy, right? Without good data, why would you make rules? And I don't, maybe I'm a conservative. I don't know how to even frame that, but it's like, should we make rules without having these stories? And, your work seems pivotal now in helping us inform, culturally where we might want to place this stuff. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think based on some of the initial data that we have on how kratom or some of the compounds in kratom may work, because what became clear relatively early on is that some of the alkaloids in kratom, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, speciosa, some of the other alkaloids that are the indole alkaloids, act as partial agonists, some of them as partial agonists on the opioid receptors, specifically on the mu-opioid receptor. That was just like, you tell the FDA something acts on the opioid receptor, and they see immediately, oh my gosh, we've got something else that might contribute to the opioid epidemic. I think that was kind of the concern of the FDA, which is a legitimate concern. But I think, as you pointed out, there is more to the story. You need to look at the whole picture. And when we look, for example, that is what I see as one important story here. For example, when you look at Colorado after it legalized recreational use of cannabis, and you see how opioid overdoses trended downward, you kind of see how sometimes something that you really want to ban and where you see lots of bad things happening, here you really see the benefit of it, right? Where it can actually benefit people. And cannabis has its benefits. We know CBD, for example, we know that THC has benefits, and we use it actually in that context. Now, I think we have to be careful with how we approach kratom, because if we approach it in the same manner as we did initially with cannabis, then we're throwing research really back. And we also do something that might hinder those who currently use kratom to actually use it as a mitigation strategy for opioid use disorders or to relieve their pain and other conditions that prevents them or that steers them away from using opioids in the first place. And we might really do a lot of harm unintentionally, rather than preventing opioid use disorders.
Yeah, this is an interesting reframe. So, traditionally in the West, we go to a doctor and then we pick up our drugs from the pharmacy and then we consume it that way. So we have kind of this, three-part system in a sense. And, being able to just go buy your medicine, I'm doing air quotes, everybody. You're then kind of breaking that chain a little bit. And, I'm kind of all about it, but it's also, I see that there can be some issues with it. I just, I don't want to restrict people's freedom to self-treat because I can barely afford to go to a doctor. So I get it myself. But, somebody who has a real situation, if they can just go buy a plant somewhere and it helps them, great. Like, why not? But, really, I'm kind of curious about how people in your profession, working in pharmacy or medicinal chemistry, like how is this like kind of self-treatment model perceived? Is it like taboo, or is that?
Yeah. So I think for us, we don't look at it from a medicinal chemistry point of view. I wouldn't say that I look at it as a taboo at all, because we don't necessarily think of it that way. What we're looking at it is that a potential to actually help people? What is then later on to be figured out is, what kind of initial safety measures need to be implemented. And that is more of the regulatory framework that needs to be put around that. So because we know that has been emerging in recent years is that there are potential for drug interactions if you take kratom together with other drugs. We know that there are certain CYP enzymes which play a role in metabolism of drugs, can interfere if kratom is taken together with other drugs. Obviously, since we know that kratom interacts with opioid receptors, if somebody is already taking an opioid, if they take kratom on top of that, there might be an additive effect to that. We know that kratom, based on its traditional uses and on user report data that we have now from more than 15,000 people cumulatively of all of the surveys that have been taken, and from its traditional use, that it has certain stimulant properties. Somebody who has, for example, a cardiovascular disorder like hypertension or like, those people might have to be careful in taking kratom. So I think self-treatment certainly is something that I agree with you that that freedom should be preserved. But I also think that in the interest of that not everybody is a medical professional, that there should be some consultation with a healthcare professional prior to engaging with that self-care. Yes, you might not need to necessarily have a full checkup with a physician, but at least potentially talk to a pharmacist who is knowledgeable about drug interactions, and also ensure, and I think that is the most important thing, that the product that you are buying actually is of good quality, that it contains what it says it contains. So if we talk about kratom, is it contaminated? Are there heavy metals in there? Is there microbial contamination in there? That has been major issues that the FDA has also been calling out, and I think righteously so. Is there potential contamination with other substances in there? Are there benzodiazepines in there? Are there opioids in there? Which is this gray market area or black market area. So another consequence of if we place it into Schedule 1 is that we would push it entirely onto the black market, something that certainly will not benefit kratom users at all. So that's another argument against scheduling it that I can foresee. And there are plenty of examples that we see if we talk about fentanyl contamination with opioids or even with benzodiazepines that are circulating on the black market.
Well, we're seeing it years ago in Canada. They were selling, or a couple folks were selling fentanyl on LSD type blotter paper. So just like and it was Albert Hoffman images on it. So people would think it was LSD, in fact, actually fentanyl. So you never really know. And this is one of these reasons why I'm so heavy on this drug war topic, is nobody knows what they have. The cocaine supply is, monstrously contaminated, and we've lost a lot of people to it. So, we've got to figure out how to address it. But I want to kind of go back to this, I guess we'll call it a gray market. So how kratom's sold often in the US is at, gas stations, or there's kind of these new types of shops that are just kratom shops. What kind of contamination have you picked up on? Has there been heavy metal and microbial stuff or drugs included, like benzodiazepines?
So we haven't seen benzodiazepines or opioids necessarily, but we have seen microbial contamination and heavy metals. Heavy metals is really the primary thing, and that might have either been introduced as part of the drying and grinding process because of relatively old equipment. The way that the leaf material is dried and then processed directly in Southeast Asia is with relatively old equipment that might contain lead, or iron or some other stuff, aluminum, and lead is really the primary contaminant that has been found. Microbial, in terms of microbial contamination, you can expect to see that in any kind of leaf material, or whatever is from nature will come with some kind of microbial contamination. It's just natural. So that's one thing to be conscious about, and to be those who, for example, have an immune disorder or a weakened immune system. If they take products like that are not extracts, that are not extracted with alcohols, for example, then you might be able to also be exposed to microbes or to spores of microbes and fungi or anything like that might be weakening your immune system, or might cause infections. That's something to be aware of. There are certain products, however, that go through sterilization or have are alcoholic extracts of it. They, on the other side, then contain often much higher amounts of mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine, and then you have much higher exposure levels than just the native kratom leaf material. So,
right, kind of doing, when you do a certain kind of extract, you're increasing potency.
Yes.
Often is kind of what you're getting, kind of like coca leaf to cocaine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, lead is probably the scariest, is what I'm picking up, and then secondarily, you could be getting contaminated with microbes, and your immune system could take some hits.
Yeah.
Yeah, both of those seem to make a lot of sense, and obviously, we want a healthy immune system. I hope that's obvious. So people should, be careful. Do you have any guidance that you would give users on like how to navigate that? Is there like a certification from a group or something?
So the only what we currently have, the current situation is, because you spoke of a gray market, is that the FDA did not approve at all kratom for any use or as a dietary supplement. So it's not regulated as a dietary supplement in the US. As such, we face the situation that basically the FDA opposes any use or even the import of kratom as a product. So sometimes it is seized at the port of import. So like at the border or like. But then the industry is kind of self-regulating. So we have certain vendors that actually adhere to the American Kratom Association's good manufacturing practices. And if you go to the website of the American Kratom Association, you will find those that are currently have that certification, adhere to GMP, good manufacturing practices. And most of them will test for microbial contamination, for toxic metals, and will also adhere to a maximum concentration of 7-hydroxymitragynine below 2% in the final product. Certain states also have implemented the Kratom Consumer Protection Act or some variation of that. So that's basically entailing some form of these good manufacturing practices set by AKA, and then certain other limitations. For example, warning statements that it should not be taken by pregnant or breastfeeding women, that it's not being sold to anybody under 18 years of age, or that it might impair somebody when they're operating a vehicle. So common sense approaches basically that I think are necessary and benefit users who want to take kratom.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, rewinding just a little bit, I'm kind of curious about um, how the chemicals in the plant work on us. So largely, you said agonists or partial agonists of the opioid receptors. Is that right?
Partial agonists. So what we know so far in terms of the opioid activity, they serve as partial. So mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, we know for certain act as partial agonists at the mu opioid receptor. Um, we we do know that mitragynine itself is less potent than morphine. 7-hydroxymitragynine is more potent than morphine. But 7-hydroxymitragynine is present in a lot lower concentrations in the plant material, if at all. We know that mitragynine to some degree is metabolized by CYP enzymes in the liver. So once it is absorbed into the bloodstream after oral ingestion, it needs to be absorbed. And then in the liver, it is metabolized mitragynine, partially at least, not entirely, but partially to 7-hydroxymitragynine. And then 7-hydroxymitragynine actually acts on mu opioid receptors as a partial agonist. And partial agonism is comparable to maybe most closely what people know as buprenorphine, which is also a partial agonist at mu opioid receptors. Synthetic. Buprenorphine is synthetic.
Right. Thank you. And a common piece of maybe folk knowledge around kratom is that yes, opioids can be really suppressing of your cardiovascular system, and to the point where you can stop breathing. Right. That's one of the common uses, or maybe downstream, perhaps unintended consequences. And then, are we seeing that in kratom to the same degree, or is it substantially? Can we fairly say it's substantially safer than most opioid products on the prescription market?
Yes. So what we have seen in animal experiments and from human reports, so case reports in the literature, which we have maybe up to 30 so far. So these are single or very few reports of overdose exposures or where kratom was involved in an overdose exposure that was reported in the literature, that respiratory depression or respiratory failure, which is the greatest concern with opioids, and is probably responsible for most of the overdose deaths attributed to opioids. Acute overdose deaths attributed to opioids is not seen with kratom. We see a number of other adverse effects in which kratom is involved, which appear to consist of polysubstance use exposures. So not only kratom alone, but also other substances, benzodiazepines, opioids, or other substances like stimulants, alcohol. So, for example, if somebody who has used alcohol for years in advance is then using kratom and shows signs of liver injury or failing liver, then contributing that to kratom use, to relatively recent kratom use, appears to be a stretch, but yet it is being done in the literature. But liver symptoms and liver adverse effects is what seems to be appearing as the most frequent adverse effect of high dose kratom use.
Do you have like a speculation on why that's happening in the liver?
So
or good evidence?
There is. We were not in the literature. What we do not see is that being reproduced in animals. So if we had the same the same effects seen in animals, in rats or in mice or in other animals, we would have a better understanding of the mechanism, but we do not. We do not see that reproduced in animals. So that's an indication that it's likely not just due to kratom exposure, but something else that is going on.
It's very interesting. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And in popular press, and I've even heard rumors myself of people um, dying. Like, is there any kind of scenario you could see somebody dying from exposure to kratom? Is it like if you're really drunk and then you add this on top, or maybe you're already using opioids and you add this on top, or I don't know. Like a friend's mother allegedly died from it, and I heard this person had like a pretty tremendous drug history, problematic drug history, and perhaps that was the thing that pushed her over the edge. But I don't know. Like I hear these reports, and I don't really know what to do with them, other than say there's probably something else going on based on what I know. But how do you relate to that stuff?
Yeah, so the FDA has, I don't know what the latest number is, and I certainly do not want to discount or want to say that anybody who dies of drug related exposure should be discounted. So, but the last count was in the 60s or 70s that where kratom was definitely involved or was mentioned in the death attributed to the death. In almost all of these cases, as you stated, there was not only kratom involved. There were other compounds, other substances found. It doesn't necessarily always have to be an illicit use of the drug. It can be that somebody was completely legitimately prescribed an opioid, a benzodiazepine, and then they did not feel adequate pain relief, adequate symptom relief, and they added kratom to it. And the self-treatment of kratom then resulted in a potential drug interaction that led to a fatality. Does that mean that kratom was the causative agent? That is the problem. Since we do not know exactly what the effects of kratom are, because the only system that we currently really have explored for kratom is the opioid system. And we know that other systems, other neurotransmitter systems, when we talk about the adrenergic system, when we talk about the serotonergic system, are also involved in its activity. That is something that we still need to kind of figure out. What we know from the post-mortem levels of mitragynine, which is what is reported, is that they vary variable. They fluctuate very, very much. So from that, we cannot correlate the exposure to kratom. So if it's very low in a post-mortem case, the mitragynine levels, what does that tell us about the actual exposure level to kratom? It doesn't tell us a lot. So we cannot conclude if kratom was causative in these cases or not. It seems to be more likely than not, to use that legal phrase, that kratom is not the only agent that is causative in these fatalities, that it is a combination of drugs that people were exposed to at the time of death.
Okay. Um, I'm trying to think. Could you just give us like a quick example of how maybe a benzodiazepine plus kratom or plus alcohol could be physiologically problematic for somebody or dangerous?
So when we look at how alcohol and benzodiazepines work, they are sedatives, right? At high doses, alcohol is a sedative, can by itself actually cause a fatality. So if you drink high amounts of alcohol in a relative brief period of time, then that that alcohol is sticking around in your system. It's not leaving your body as quickly, so it accumulates, and it basically can cause you to fall into a coma. Add to that then a substance that interacts with opioid receptors, and if you use a relatively high dose of that at the same time, then that can be an additive effect that can get you deeper into the coma, can potentially then cause respiratory depression in combination with the alcohol that also causes respiratory depression at that point. And then you have kind of the perfect storm. When we talk about benzodiazepines, same thing there. They by themselves would not cause respiratory failure, but if you then have something that acts on the opioid receptors, the bets are off at that point. And since we do not know what else Kratom is doing, it becomes kind of a gamble or a guessing game. So I don't necessarily want to speculate how that exactly works together, but it could happen that somebody would then reach a potential physiological state where either the cardiovascular system or the respiratory system is not able to operate any longer.
Yeah, thank you. That opens up a lot of interesting questions around, what's what's actually maybe some of the hottest topics in kratom research currently. Are people looking at these, open questions actively about what else might be going on beyond opioid activity?
Yes. So Chris McCurdy and his research group, who have received or who are supported by NIDA funding, National Institutes on Drug Abuse funding, are definitely looking at much of the preclinical research regarding not only mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. They have really branched out and look at many of the other alkaloid activities. So speciosa, they recently published on that, spikyoginin. So the isomers are structurally very, very similar to mitragynine, yet a little bit different. And even that small difference may have an impact on how they act on, for example, the adrenergic system, the serotonergic system. And we know that when it comes to the adrenergic system or the serotonergic system, that these activities may contribute to the stimulant effects, for example. And we know that certain adrenergic antagonists, when it comes to the alpha-2 receptor, an adrenergic receptor, may actually play a role in mitigating withdrawal symptoms. So we have clonidine, which is used in mitigation of withdrawal symptoms. So that might actually play a role in the benefits that some users receive when they use Kratom in mitigating withdrawal symptoms from opioids or from stimulants alike. So we basically now go back from these surveys and from some human observations, and we try to look at animal data and in vitro cell line data to actually find the active components and the mechanisms by which these effects that humans report are actually elicited. What are the mechanisms that underlie these effects that we observe in humans?
That's excellent. I guess now I'm curious about these different kind of subcultivars, red vein, blue vein, like all that stuff. Can you describe what's going on there? Because as far as I know, there's one species, but I could be very wrong.
There's only one species, Mitragyna speciosa, and from everything that I have heard, they, no matter if it's a red vein, if it's a white vein, if it's a green vein, or now they have yellow vein. I haven't heard yet blue vein. I might be behind the
I could have made
trends.
that up.
Okay. So I heard of blue blood, but I might have been. Anyways, they all grow on the same tree. So it's different ages of the leaf, basically. So the red leaves are younger leaves, and then the white leaves and the green leaves are aged leaves. They are older leaves, and even from the alkaloid content, there are some shifts in alkaloids, but not really in the mitragynine concentration. So there's a seasonal shift in mitragynine concentration, but not necessarily an age-related shift in terms of the red or the white or the green leaf. So there's one paper at least that Chris McCurdy together with Brian Pearson has published on that has also fertilizer content and different conditions down in Florida, because they cultivating uh, Kratom trees down there, and they looked at the composition, the chemical composition over different stages of growth and all of that. So all of it comes from the same tree. It's just different ages of the leaf, basically, when they harvest it.
All right, that's good to know. And different concentrations, but we don't have like super clear data on what's what. Okay.
No, but one note of caution here is that we're only looking at the alkaloids so far. So when we look, for example, at red versus white versus green, alkaloids are not colored. We have other ingredients. We have the terpenoids, we have the flavonoids, and some of them are not well explored. We have a little bit of an understanding of, there are these terpenoids, these general, but secondary metabolites that are kind of the primary pharmacologically active ingredients in most of what we recognize as chemical diversity in plants. So cocaine, for example, in erythroxylon coca, or morphine in Papaver somniferum, or that's really what we still need to explore very much. And that's why just using mitragynine as a single compound might not represent at all the pharmacological activity of what kratom as an overall plant composite will give to a user.
Right. So you're bringing up some nice memories for me. So I spent many hundreds of hours, I believe, listening to the late great Terence McKenna give lectures, and this term alkaloid kept coming up over and over and over again, to the point where in my early days I was of the impression alkaloid meant all plant-based psychoactives or any kind of molecule that did something to the body from a plant, which is not really true at all. Can you give us like a quick definition of alkaloid for us?
Yeah, so alkaloid is basically a compound that contains a basic nitrogen atom. And there are certainly lots of compounds out there that meet that criteria. But if you look at cannabis pharmacology, THC does not meet that criteria. When we look at Salvia divinorum, diviner sage, salvinorin A does not meet that criteria. So, and for a long time, we have always thought alkaloids are like, before sliced bread, long before sliced bread, they were like the best thing before sliced bread. But no, they're not. There are many other compounds that play a role in affecting humans, not for the sake of actually the plant producing it because they want to affect humans, but because of adaptability, because of environmental adaptability of the plant.
Right. And I don't want to blame Terence McKenna for that. It's just my naivete, taking too much advice from him. You got to couch him appropriately. For those who are in the know, you probably understand. Um, but yeah, it's really fascinating. There's so much to plant chemistry. I remember being in a talk given at this really interesting conference called Bioneers, maybe around 2009 or 2008, maybe. And the whole talk was on green chemistry and how resource intensive kind of modern Western chemistry is, and say like how high tech plants look in terms of how well they create all these chemicals with such a low cost. Well, compared to what we're doing. It's just a really fascinating conversation. Plants are amazing chemists, is the long and short, I think, of that point.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, they are.
Yeah.
But that's what evolution does. It kind of over millennia is optimizing what we are just beginning to understand and unravel.
Yeah, absolutely. So are you seeing any like how do we want to say this? I'm tempted to go speculative again. Just like any hopes for like the future of kratom? Are we going to see it go totally illegal? I don't know how closely you're following the political situation, or are we going to see it included in medicine somehow, or might it just kind of stay this somewhat folk plant? Um,
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in recent months, the WHO had a hearing on kratom and considering it for either including it on the list of controlled substances. And if that were to happen, then the FDA would certainly have a reason to follow through with its recommendation again to the DEA, and the DEA would have reason to also then place it into Schedule 1. So that is certainly a one way that things could turn out in the future. The other way, and in terms of kratom being an approved medicine or drug, that is not likely to happen because kratom is a natural product, and as such, it will always be. It's not like a single chemical entity, right? It's not a single compound, so it's very unlikely that it's going to be approved by the FDA as similar to like aspirin or ibuprofen or something like that. Not very likely. It would be very novel for the FDA to do that. We have that in Germany. We have St. John's wort and stuff like that approved as a drug, but it's not going to happen here. I don't think so. The one pathway forward I could see is potentially as a dietary supplement. If there are some potential limitations placed on it with labeling and GMP and all of that. We see movement on the state level that the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is making more headway in several states, and that might be the sensible pathway forward, that more states are regulating it specifically in that category with a particular act to impose GMP measures and labeling standards and all of that, which is unique, which really places it into a unique category on the state level. And maybe that's also where it heads on the federal level. But that might be the most sensible pathway forward for it.
Since you brought up Germany, I'm kind of curious, like, what is this difference in the German system versus what we have here? Because Germany seems to have different things available sometimes sooner, if not ever, available here. So I'm thinking more on the regenerative medicine side, like PRP, Regenikine, like all these really interesting things. But what's different about how the way Germany's doing this versus what we're doing over here in the States?
Well, in regards to at least plant medicines, when I look back on my pharmacy education, we had basically almost a quarter, maybe 20%, dedicated to phytochemistry and the botany of medicinal plants. because it is just such a traditional part of what pharmacists have been doing for centuries, right? Modern medicine and the use of synthetic drugs has been around for maybe 60 years, 70, 80 years by now. I mean, we have really started to introduce slowly synthetic medicinal drugs in the 50s, 40s, 30s, maybe. And before that, it was really like a Wild West a little bit, right? And then standardization plays a big role for everything that relates to medicinal products. And that's why it's still part of the German pharmacopoeia, which is a government entity in Germany. It's not like the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is a private entity. So that's why, for example, people can get St. John's wort prescribed, and it's covered by health insurance as an antidepressant, or valerian prescribed, if because you can buy these products either for self-treatment, or you can get them prescribed if you need them as a sleeping aid, as an antidepressant, because they are standardized. They have to adhere to certain criteria that are very strictly set by the German pharmacopoeia and the BfArM, which is the equivalent of the FDA.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm seeing since America's such a young country, relatively speaking, and a young culture, it seems to have cut a little bit from history and this kind of plant, folk medicine. But it's kind of really interesting to me to hear that you've got botany training as part of your, education. That's really, really cool. And it kind of reminds me of like a Renaissance kind of polymaths doing their interesting work. But yeah, I would agree that I don't necessarily see that changing domestically here in the U.S. anytime soon. It's a little bit too much of a hegemony, maybe. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe there's just like a certain kind of bias, we only want these isolated things, like whole plants are, too hard to study, which I get it. There's a lot more variables added in when you do a whole plant versus a isolate molecule, right?
Yeah, there is. It all depends how you want to regulate it, how strict you want your regulations to be. On the other side, there's still very much a dysregulated or not very well regulated market for dietary supplements in the United States. And I don't know that necessarily increases consumer confidence in dietary supplements. And yet they, about 50% of US adults take herbal and dietary supplements. So clearly there is a desire for those products. But that's kind of a side note.
Yeah, it's endlessly interesting topic, these plant and the supplement conversation. I'm seeing a lot of people talk about mushrooms as now a wellness product, as opposed to I'm thinking psychedelic like Psilocybin cubensis, but mushrooms generally being wellness products, not necessarily drugs or these other categories that could get confusing. So interesting, but I don't really know what to do with that.
I think it depends on where you. So, similar to Kratom, there are multiple uses for a product, and what you want to use it for. If you want to use it for a health condition, for a diagnosed or for a self-diagnosed sometimes, or for a healthcare provider diagnosed condition, I think there's certainly a good use for it. In these situations, I think it's always good to be aware what are the limitations of such products. What do I need to consider when I take it in conjunction with other medications? What do I need to be aware of? And I think then it's important to really talk to healthcare providers and to inform everybody, yes, I'm taking this additional product. There needs to be an open conversation. And I think it's also the healthcare professionals' obligation to remain open to these alternative or at least integrative uses. I would call them integrative uses. I think that's a better use than going out on a limb to alternative uses. And I think that more healthcare professionals are open to that now when they were just 10 or 15 years ago, because they can't just push it away and say, just do what I say. And because people are otherwise just taking it without their knowledge, they become more and more aware of that. And so they at least want to have that conversation. At least I hope that they do want to have that conversation. But patients also become more and more aware that of their own health, and they want to be engaged with it. If that is shrooms because of PTSD or of depression, anxiety disorders, I think here it's really important to engage with the patient on both ends to really see, okay, I've read here and there on some website, this is what it's good for. Now, what does the science say? Because we now have scientific evidence what it is effective for. Is it actually going to benefit me? What kind of shrooms should I take? And so on and so forth. I think a conversation needs to be had on these topics, both inside these confidential practices where patients and healthcare professionals interact, as well as within the scientific community. How can we facilitate these conversations? The same goes for Kratom. I think we need to have conversations where patients feel empowered to share their information and what they're doing, what they want to do with the healthcare professionals, with the healthcare providers, and that they do not feel shunned by what they want to engage with or what they're already engaging with.
Beautiful. So are you actively researching Kratom currently, working on new research?
Great. Yes, I do.
Can you say anything about it?
Well, I can tell you that you mentioned top tree herbs and Soren. We are currently looking because the products that they have, the tea products, are quite different in terms of, you basically use them as a tea. And so you're not getting all the sludge from the powdered products. They have a very different profile in terms of the way that they are ingested, because you don't have the sludge that you would just basically part of it you would definitely ingest. So we are looking at those products, and we sending out a survey to folks who are drinking those products, and we analyzing their products, and we want to see how do those products compare to other Kratom products out there in terms of effects, in terms of benefits, in terms of adverse effects, how folks are using it, how much do they use, and all of that. So we really looking forward to analyzing that data from the survey, as well as how much does actually extract into just a water decoction versus a sludge, basically a powder sludge.
Right. And the sludge can cause some GI discomfort for some folks. Is that right?
Yes. So we don't have the data yet for this particular actively ongoing survey. So we definitely want to see how that compares in terms of adverse effects as well as beneficial effects. That the sludge that people sometimes, they steer the cup before they chuck it down. It is, can you extract more of because what we primarily see in the literature is methanol. Methanol is used as the solvent. And yes, you get a lot more of mitragynine that you can then show in your results, but that is not what people are using, right? Nobody's using methanol, hopefully, because we would have a ton of people that are going blind. Please don't use methanol ever to to drink your kratom. Most people, everybody is using water. So how much are you actually getting with water out of your kratom preparation? That's what we're looking at the moment. Everybody is reporting methanol in the literature or something else, but that's not what actually people are getting out of it.
Right, right. Yeah, scientists should be looking at what, well, I don't want to tell scientists what to do, but if you want to be in there for the public good, yeah, what's actually happening in the real world and how can we help keep people safe and understand what's happening? So the last question, and this is probably, I hope, an easy one. A lot of people are concerned about dependence. Do you have any tips for folks who want to avoid any kind of dependency?
Yeah, I think so. Those who have not yet used kratom or are just beginning to use kratom, the best way to start off with any kind of drug, I think, and I'm by no means an expert when it comes to drug use, recreational or otherwise, is
Got that
to
covered.
so you probably much better, yeah, or whoever is more in aligned with that, but is to start low and start slow. So if you have a particular condition for which you want to use kratom, if it is chronic pain, if it is a mental or emotional disorder like depression, anxiety, start with a low dose. Start with something like 1 gram and see if it helps you. If it benefits you at such a low dose, awesome. There's no need to increase the dose. If that's what you're using it for, don't increase the dose. If it doesn't help you, and wait. The waiting game is the most important thing. If you see pain relief at a low dose, go with it. If you need to increase it slowly. Go with 1.5 grams, go with 2 grams. See if that helps you. Try it out a number of times and rate yourself on a visual analog scale from 1 to 10, in your mind. Envision, are you feeling improvement? Is your pain going down? Are you improving in terms of your mood or your emotional state? That's kind of the best way that you can judge if it is benefiting you. Once you reach a dose of 3 grams per dose and you're dosing it 4 times a day and you don't see any improvement in your condition, then I would not go further or I would stop. If you stop and you see adverse effects, if you see withdrawal effects or anything like that kicking in, headaches, gastrointestinal or anything like that, then it would be time to consult with a healthcare professional, because withdrawal symptoms, you want to be sure that you manage that appropriately, or decrease the dose slowly. That's also good until these withdrawal symptoms are mitigated or going away. I would not go higher than 3.5 to maximum of 4 grams. I would not go higher than that per dose. Above that, some people may experience potentially severe adverse effects. So that's a safe dose to keep in mind. That's basically my recommendation. And in terms of products, we already talked about that. Good manufacturing practices, what is recommended by AKA.
I love it. All right. I guess any final words before we kind of close up here?
I would like to thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
This was a great talk. You gave me some relatively easy questions. It was really conversational, and if I can ever be of help again or throw in my 2 cents worth of knowledge or opinion, happy to be there again.
Well, Dr. Oliver Grundmann, University of Florida, Gainesville, really appreciate you being here, and hope we can do it again because this is actually wildly informative for me. And thank you for your work out there.
Certainly. Pleasure.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Dr. Good Lord, my brain. Yeah, we're going to have to restart that, Mike. My brain apparently is not appropriately caffeinated yet. All right, so here we go again.